The United States education system has wasted over $100 billion on a teaching methodology that actually undermines students' learning, all because they believed a myth that has been disproven repeatedly. Nobody ever checked it out. They just put the system in place, wasting vast sums of money only to put students farther behind. And even worse, they continue spending even more money perpetuating this detrimental myth, all while today's students struggle even more. Do students deserve to be taught in a way that works? Do students deserve better? We think so. We will reveal this myth and how it became ingrained in the school system, so you don't let it waste your time and efforts. We'll also cover teaching methods that do work, strategies that have scientific backing instead of just opinions. After watching this video, you'll be able to spot this ineffective teaching method and opt out, and instead demand proven methods that work, so you or your child can get an education that serves you the way it should. To understand how the education system got here, imagine this ridiculous scenario. Imagine that you lived in a culture that knew nothing about nutrition. In this culture, the wise men have noticed that cake, cookies, ice cream, and pie make children happy and energized. So they come up with a dogma that cake, cookies, ice cream, and pie are a solution whenever a child feels low. Your child gets the flu. So, of course, we know what the remedy is. It's obvious. Everyone knows, especially the wise men. So everyone tells you what to do. Feed them cake, cookies, ice cream, and pie. Indeed, they will feel happy and energized in no time. And of course, after forcing down buckets of cake, cookies, ice cream, and pie, your child is now over the toilet, sicker than ever before. Now, compare that to this scenario. Your child is struggling in school, so everyone tells you that the problem is the teaching framework. Everyone knows this. It is common knowledge. So, a new teaching framework is prescribed, but it doesn't work. So, since it wasn't a teaching method, it must be the student. The student must just be stupid. At least that's what the student assumes. Like the sweets remedy, the teaching method remedy took it from bad to worse. And this happens every day in our schools. It occurs because the biggest education myth ever told somehow caught hold and became a belief. Are you ready to find out what the myth is and how it started? To understand, we must understand our education system's roots and how it was created. That will shed some light on how we got to where we are today. So, the United States education system did not originate in the US. The Western education system began with the industrial model of education, also known as the factory model of education. Does that sound like something with the student's interest in mind? Not at all. It was designed to rebuild an empire. In 1806, Prussia declared war on France and then lost. Napoleon defeated them at the Battle of Jena-Auerstedt. Prussia was devastated. The economy, social structure, military, and political system were in shambles. They needed to rebuild. The Prussians believed in a strong, centralized state based on power, and to get that, they needed the citizens to be obedient, disciplined, and have a strong sense of duty. If they could create that, they could rebuild their once great military and return to power. So they devised a plan to teach blind obedience, iron-fisted discipline, and unswerving loyalty to the children. Here's how they did it. Number 1, education became compulsory, ensuring that every child became a productive and compliant member of society. Number 2, they implemented centralized control and standardization. The state controlled what teachers taught and how they did it, spreading state values across the population. Number 3, they enforced a state-controlled curriculum that reflected the values and ideologies the government wanted to promote, with a strong emphasis on nationalism. Number 4, militaristic discipline and order. Punctuality, neatness, regularity, and obedience were highly valued and strictly enforced. Number 5, authoritarian classroom structure with a clear authority figure who directs the learning process and maintains strict discipline. The structure reinforced respect for authority and obedience to rules. Number 6, rote learning and memorization. The emphasis on rote learning and memorization of facts rather than on critical thinking and inquiry instilled the state's values and knowledge without encouraging questioning or dissent. Number 7, state training of teachers, inculcating in them the values and ideologies of the state. Number 8, inspection and supervision ensured that schools and teachers adhered to the prescribed curriculum and teaching methods. They enforced uniformity and adherence to state standards across all schools. This system successfully rebuilt state power. However, we must remember that this militaristic society favored state authority over individual freedoms and creativity. Their system favored ideals that ran counter to Western thought. Nevertheless, American education reformer Horace Mann, the father of common school movement, noticed the Prussian system. Mann and Henry Barnard, the U.S. Commissioner on Education, saw it as a solution to the needs of the Industrial Revolution. This system could churn out factory workers, and it worked. The American Industrial Revolution paved the way for America's new economic power, but at a cost. Just like the Prussian system, the U.S. system did not prioritize students' needs. It did not promote critical thinking or creativity. Instead, it emphasized rote learning, standardization, and age-graded classrooms where students move up by age rather than skill, just like in factories. But things were to change. 100 years later, movement began to emerge. The pendulum started to swing in the other direction. Turning out students like the factories turned out products wasn't such a good idea. Educators began to recognize individual differences in students' learning, so they thought maybe students were individuals with individual needs. At the same time, the field of psychology was rapidly expanding, with new theories about cognition, personality, and learning. Psychologists began exploring the idea that individuals might have unique ways of processing information. In 1983, Howard Gardner proposed the theory of multiple intelligences, suggesting that people have different types of intelligence. Next came Neil Fleming's VARK model. This model categorized learners based on their sensory preferences: visual, auditory, reading, writing, and kinesthetic. Such simplicity and clarity were intuitively appealing. Such an easy-to-understand idea made for an easy adoption. Parents and teachers had already noticed that students seemed to engage more with certain types of instruction. So, it was an easy jump to assume that students had preferred ways of learning. Students were visual, auditory, reading, or kinesthetic learners. It made perfect sense and explained why some students didn't thrive in the old system. An obvious way to personalize education arose: the learning styles approach. This was a gold mine for commercial interests. Textbook creators jumped on the bandwagon. They injected money into advertising and lobbying to promote the learning styles approach. They funded workshops for teachers. They promoted the idea in every way possible because it made them vast amounts of money. And that is how the learning styles myth was born, an idea that is still strongly promoted by just about everyone in education for decades now. The only problem, it doesn't work. It's been conclusively proven wrong. In the 1990s, studies began challenging the validity of the learning styles framework. They failed to find any evidence that the learning styles teaching improved learning outcomes. Then in 2008, Passler, McDaniel, Rohrer, and Bjork published a paper called Learning Styles, Concepts and Evidence. This heavily cited paper reviewed the existing literature on learning styles and found no evidence to support it. Numerous studies later verified the findings. Many of them call learning styles a mere myth. None found evidence supporting it, and many disproved it entirely. Even cognitive psychology and neuroscience jumped on board, providing more insights into how learning occurs. And yes, there certainly is a solid sensory component to learning. However, separating students into learning styles does not work. We will cover what sensory approach works at the end of this video. But first, let's cover proven ways to improve how students learn. First, let's cover memory strategies. Memory strategies have been used for millennia and are proven to work. Let's cover 7 of them, one of which is all but banned in mainstream classrooms. Strategy number 1. You might click away right now if I told you that repetition and practice were the keys to strengthening memory. Most people hate rote memorization. It's boring. And done wrong? Ineffective. The wrong way? Repetition over and over. Boring, right? That doesn't work because it lulls the brain to sleep. Instead, read the thing, then effortfully try to remember it. Then repeat. The effort wakes up the brain and says, get to work on this. The way to memorize is actually to practice memorizing, not to practice repeating. Strategy number 2. This one is brought to you by my friend Roy G. Bid, who says, my very educated mother just served us 9 pizzas, but I had to correct him and say, no. My very educated mother just served us noodles. Then, with astronomy out of the way, we got to biology. And he said, King Philip came over for good soup. And I agreed. What am I talking about here? Mnemonics, of course. Mnemonics take advantage of how our brain works. They use associations, visualizations, context, and novelty because all of these fire up the brain. But remember, nobody believes I before E except after C. That's a weird one, so don't give it much weight. It is insufficient, and if you use it, you will not be proficient. Strategy number 3. Have you ever seen memory competitions where people memorize long strings of numbers or even the phone book? Like Rajveer Meena of India, who can recite 70,000 decimal places of pi. How does he do it? Most use a technique called chunking. The real pros layer on other techniques as well. Techniques such as the method of Lotzi, a technique used by the ancient Romans and Greeks. But the primary takeaway is that the brain likes chunks of a specific size. Chunking reduces the cognitive load on working memory and aligns with the brain's natural inclination for pattern recognition and organization. It's why phone numbers are 10 digits, but split into 3, 3, and 4. Our brain likes those smaller chunks. Strategy number 4. Do you remember what happened after Cinderella lost her slipper? Or what type of slipper it was? Who was in bed when Little Red Riding Hood arrived at her grandmother's house? What do witches who live in gingerbread houses like to eat? Who stole Christmas? What sort of animal wears a hat while eating green eggs and ham? And who snuck in and kissed Snow White while she was sleeping? We remember these things because our brains are storytelling machines. We use stories to remember. We use stories to make sense of the world. Storytelling likely goes back to the pre-linguistic periods of human development. Early humans told stories through dance, gestures, mimicry, and music. Our brains were wired for stories before they were wired for language, which makes storytelling a powerful memory technique. Strategy number 5. Seneca said, when I teach, I learn. He was right. When you learn something, immediately teach it to someone else. That will cement it into your mind. Teaching will also reveal if you understand it. Those ancient Romans had this learning stuff down. Strategy number 6. Summarizing, questioning, and predicting. Teachers today call this active engagement, but in ancient times, it was called the Socratic method. Score another one for the ancient Greeks and Romans. And strategy number 7. Have you ever worked into the night to finish a project? Did you notice that as the work dragged on, you became less and less efficient? You got less and less done and became less and less motivated. And no amount of caffeine seemed to help. Our brains work best in short bursts interspersed with physical activity. The optimum learning to physical activity ratio differs by person and type of cognitive challenge. Generally, about 20 to 30 minutes of brain work followed by a short physical activity keeps the mental faculty at peak performance. And pro tip, proprioceptively challenging exercises are best. These exercises, such as gymnastics, yoga, or kung fu, challenge our coordination abilities, and in so doing, spark neurogenesis. Here's how that works. Memory is seated in the hippocampus. When the hippocampus is challenged spatially, this encourages neurogenesis, the formation of new neurons. These new neurons are then available for other learning tasks. We are growing new brain cells as we need them. Movement does not happen in classrooms. Students must remain motionless at their desks. Movement promotes focus. Kids know this intrinsically. They need to get up and move to learn. They want to move. But when they want to move too much, they get diagnosed with ADHD and given drugs to calm them down. Would it surprise you that the ancient Greeks knew movement was a part of learning? For the ancient Greeks, education was about holistically developing the body and mind. This concept, known as arete, was about achieving excellence through balance. Physical education, or gymnastics, was a critical part of a young Greek's education. Gymnasiums were places for physical training and intellectual and cultural education. The ancient Greeks knew something about education. We might do well to study their ways. Returning to the idea of learning styles and what good we can glean from them, the idea wasn't totally unfounded. We do learn through our senses. Teachers can use students' visual, auditory, and kinesthetic learning skills to develop better teaching methods. They can do this by designing lessons to be as multimodal as possible. They can strive to engage various senses. Using multiple senses enhances understanding and retention. Each subject lends itself differently to visual, auditory, or kinesthetic learning. So, the more creative the teacher, the better. For example, history and social studies work well with maps and timelines. Lectures are also a prominent part, but adding in reenactments, building models of historical artifacts, and field trips to historical sites can also engage the other learning senses. A teacher can touch on the kinesthetic with geometric shapes, graphs, and charts for math, and the auditory with lectures. There's even interactive software that can help a student visualize math. The kinesthetic is a non-brainer for physical education, but learning about the body, health, and nutrition through reading or lecture incorporates other learning modalities. We learn through all of our senses, mainly sight, sound, and touch, but even taste and smell play a part. Brilliant teachers use this to their advantage. This brings us to the most essential point, the lie implied by learning styles. Before the 1990s, scientists thought that brains did not change, that you just got what you were born with. No one knew that human brain keeps changing throughout a lifetime. Adjusting the world to a student's supposed brain type made sense when they believed brains didn't change. It's just that the static brain idea was an incorrect assumption. But this was backward. It's the brain that adapts to the world. Don't adapt the environment to the brain. Create an environment that would be beneficial for the brain to adapt to. Challenge the brain, and it will rise to the challenge. Today, we know that learning styles should have been considered learning skills. Each one is a skill that any brain can develop, not a set state that the brain comes hardwired with. Do some people start with a more natural ability for visual thinking and others have better auditory thinking? Sure, but none of this is fixed. So the real secret here is to develop each skill. We call these cognitive microskills because there are subsets of skills in each of three major categories: visual, auditory, and kinesthetic. There's a link in the description to learn more about that. The second big takeaway is this: each learning skill, visual, auditory, and kinesthetic, and each of their subsets comes with its own memory system in the brain. And all of these are rooted in spatial memory, making spatial memory the most important of all. Did you know that when people develop their spatial sense, their hippocampus grows? The hippocampus is our own memory center. And when the hippocampus grows, the amygdala shrinks. The amygdala is where fear responses come from. So, a larger amygdala is more reactive and keeps us in a state of fear, which is not a learning state. A larger hippocampus improves memory. With that in mind, the best way to enhance learning is not to adapt the environment to the brain. It is to incorporate as many cognitive processes as possible for each activity. And even more importantly, develop spatial awareness. Yoga, gymnastics, and Kung Fu are good choices for that. So is the learning success system. The learning success system enhances cognitive microskills and builds confidence in learning. A must for any struggling student. Teaching the wrong learning style to students takes the blame for many students struggling. But there is no such thing as learning styles. So the problem is something else. The learning styles myth is a misdirection that leads to a waste of time and resources. It also hides the real reason that causes children to struggle in school. And that reason most often affects the most intelligent of children. What I am talking about are hidden specific learning struggles. These hidden learning struggles fly under the radar because most people are unaware of them. But you can find out what they are in this video right here.